Let's continue our examination of some of the negative consequences of bureaucracy. Once again, we are looking at bureaucracy employing primarily the functionalist perspective. But some of the negative side effects of bureaucratic arrangements that we are going to be discussing can also be related to the conflict model. Refer again to page 5 in your third study guide, and once again there's valuable information found in chapter 5 in your textbook. Last time we looked at service without a smile. We also examined bureaucratic ritualism in the form of rules or rules. In this lesson, let's start off with goal displacement. It's important for you to remember that bureaucracies tend to perpetuate themselves. And one way they do this is through, again, the process of goal displacement. If you'll notice, goal displacement involves really what might be thought of as two elements. Bureaucracies can become rigid and can continue policies and programs even when the needs of the clients change or the original purposes of the organization have been met. An example that is noted in the textbook of this particular form of goal displacement has to do with the March of Dimes. It was created years ago in an effort to raise awareness and likewise money for research to confront what was then considered to be a very serious problem, in what was initially referred to as infantile paralysis or polio. But Dr. Jonas Salk solved that problem by creating a vaccine. And this is a very interesting point about this remarkable person, that he shared his findings free of charge with humanity. Now, you would have thought with this that perhaps the March of Dimes would fold its tents and disappear into the good night. But as it turns out, what happened is the March of Dimes came up with a new focus, primarily birth defects. But with developments in terms of genetic testing, many birth defects have been eliminated. But once again, the March of Dimes didn't disappear. It took on a whole new focus: stronger, healthier babies, which means it may be around forever. On the other hand, there are examples of other organizations that might fit the bill here. McShonis, for example, points out that the Department of Agriculture maintains agricultural agents in almost all American counties, yet only one county in roughly 7 or 8 has working farms. So the Department of Agriculture has redefined its goals and now performs a wide range of activities not directly related to farming, such as nutritional and environmental research. But you want to bear in mind, too, that there is a second form of goal displacement, B. Here, literally again, the original goals of an organization are replaced by goals and or arrangements that really benefit more than anything else the interest of the bureaucrats in charge. An example of this that is sometimes highlighted by critics: annual Girl Scout sales. They generate today somewhere in excess of $400 million each year. There are 332 regional Girl Scout councils around the country. Each has an office and a paid staff overseen by a volunteer board. Some councils serve up to 12,000 girls. What critics tend to highlight is that over 1/2 of a council's income typically comes from Girl Scout sales. Each council runs its own cookie sales. sets prices per box, and divides the proceeds as it sees fit. Typically, troops get between 10 and 15% of the profit. The councils take more than half, and the manufacturer gets the rest. What critics are very concerned about is that after getting a majority share of the cookie sales profits, councils then tap into each troop's much smaller share by charging troop members for a wide variety of things. For example, from the badges girls receive for selling cookies to camping fees at local Girl Scout camps. The tax-free cookie proceeds mainly go to support the Girl Scouts of America's complex bureaucracy. Parkinson's law can fit in here as well. That's sort of a working explanation of it. This is a photograph of Parkinson, the individual who came up with this very, very interesting note and idea. And you want to keep in mind that Parkinson's law is one of a number of satirical criticisms of bureaucracy. Parkinson argued that the natural tendency of any formal organization is to grow. Employees are dependent on the organization for their livelihood. Therefore, they've got a vested interest in promoting the organization and the sections or units of which they are a part. One way to protect themselves, he argued, is to create work for themselves. In other words, look busy. The busier you are, the more important you are to the organization per se. Hence his famous law, work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. Dilbert more or less highlights it. Hope all of you from time to time will read Dilbert, the comic strip. It often highlights some of the negative aspects associated with bureaucracy. Literally, again, by looking busy, by being busy, in time employees have so much to do that they start asking for assistance. And what's interesting is that when an official gains assistance, the work of the official actually increases because now he or she has to supervise subordinates. Excuse me. In turn, much of the time of the assistant is taken up by submitting reports to his or her supervisor. As work continues to increase, more and more officials and more assistants are added. Some are responsible for supervising others or dealing with the increasingly complex flow of communication among an ever and growing number of personnel. The result? A great deal of time and effort is expended on filling out forms, email communication, file keeping, checking on whether or not forms have been completed, and file keeping for others. Parkinson makes the argument that all of this is basically a waste and it's unnecessary. Excuse me again. So, bureaucracy expands to meet the needs of an expanding bureaucracy. It might be illustrated in this way by this interesting cartoon. Now, another significant problem associated with bureaucratic structures, highlighted as a negative consequence, is what is referred to by some as the iron law of oligarchy. It's something we talked about in a very generalized way in an earlier lesson, or at least I mentioned the author of the notion, Michaels. He argued that in hierarchical structures, often power becomes concentrated in the hands of a few. The result being that these few gain more power and more influence. Most workers, Michaels suggested, don't really have the knowledge or the interest to deal with complex issues. Therefore, responsibility is delegated to elected leaders. Once these folks get in office, they have the means and the incentive to take control. And as they, again, come to appreciate their power and their prestige, that is, the power and the prestige that goes with their positions, they begin to give more and more and more attention to literally, again, maintaining their elite positions within the organization itself. Now, they begin to suppress opposition in an effort to present a unified front, and they come to see themselves as indispensable. McShonis highlights the fact that oligarchies often flourish in hierarchical structures like bureaucracies, and they can help to limit the accountability of leaders to people per se. In his textbook, for example, he highlights the fact that the U.S. government has not really evolved into an all out and out oligarchy due to political competition, a system of checks and balances, as well as term limits. Yet he notes, and this is true of other social scientists as well, that incumbents still have a significant advantage since few of them are defeated by challengers in general elections. Now, in spite of what Michaels argued, that again, oligarchies tend to develop, and you'll notice again on page 5 of your study guide, some of the ways by which and through which oligarchies gain control and maintain it. Notice what they control: the funds, the records, all the plans of the organization. They're the ones that are going to be controlling the flow of information. And above all, if you buck them, you run the risk of being demoted or worse, fired. But despite his observations, keep in mind that bureaucratic inequality can be contested. Folks who are, again, down at the bottom of the heap, so to speak, those who don't have a lot of power and influence, don't just sit there and take it. They may engage in covert activities, such as subtle forms of non-cooperation. In other words, they're only going to complete the absolute minimum amount of work required by the company. Or they might even engage in sabotage. On the other hand, workers may react so slowly that they're able to literally prevent being put into action policies and programs they don't like. So bear in mind these rather significant problems associated with with bureaucratic structures. In the next lesson, we'll look at another kind of satirical analysis of what is considered to be some of the negative consequences of bureaucracy, the Peter Principle. And we're also going to look at the informal side of bureaucracies, something that Weber in his analysis of bureaucracy didn't really focus on.